They say every family has secrets, but some secrets are so old, so twisted, that they stop being secrets at all and become curses. This story begins in a forgotten valley of the Appalachian Mountains, where the roads narrow, the air thickens, and the trees seem to lean in, whispering to each other about what they've seen. Outsiders rarely visit this place. Those who do never forget it. Because here, the family that time itself seemed to reject still lingers in photographs, in records, in the silence of the woods. The story of this family begins not with love, but with isolation. Generations ago, when the first settlers came to this land, they built their cabins far apart, miles between neighbors, surrounded by mountains and superstition. Over time, distance turned to loneliness, and loneliness turned to desperation. Brothers married cousins. Cousins bore children that didn't quite look right. Children with pale, glassy eyes that never focused, voices that came out wrong, limbs that didn't move quite the way they should. The locals whispered that the bloodline had turned against itself, but no one dared confront it, because in that valley, family wasn't just family, it was survival. The old church records from the 1800s show names repeating again and again. Same last names, generation after generation, scribbled by shaky hands in fading ink. The family tree didn't grow upward, it folded inward, and buried beneath that tree were stories too painful to write down. Stories of children who were born and never baptized, of mothers who vanished in the woods, of screams that were heard but never investigated. For decades, outsiders ignored this place, calling it folklore. But it wasn't folklore. It was the documentation of what happens when a family, trapped by geography and shame, closes itself off from the rest of the world and feeds only on its own bloodline. And when the last surviving branch of that family was finally discovered, the truth that came out would shake even the most seasoned historians. Because what they found should never have been human. When the photographs first surfaced, no one believed they were real. A traveling social worker had taken them in the 1970s, deep in the backwoods of rural West Virginia. The images were grainy, black and white, but what they showed was unmistakable. Faces warped by generations of the same blood, eyes that seemed to look in two directions at once, and expressions that sat somewhere between innocence and haunting. The family, known only by a single last name whispered in that region, had lived almost entirely cut off from the outside world for over a century. No schooling, no hospitals, no church attendance, just a small, collapsing farmhouse hidden behind thick pines, a structure that looked as though it had been built by someone who had long since forgotten what a home was supposed to be. Those who encountered them told stories that spread quietly through nearby towns. A mail carrier who swore he heard animal noises coming from inside the house, but saw human shadows in the window. A sheriff's deputy who once responded to a call there, only to turn around halfway down the dirt road, claiming it wasn't worth the trouble. And a young reporter who tried to document their life and left the valley before dawn, pale and silent, refusing to talk about what he'd seen. When researchers later traced the family tree, it was almost impossible to follow. Names repeated, dates overlapped, and entire branches seemed to circle back to each other. It was as though the family's history was trapped in an endless loop, generation after generation, marrying within the same few names, until even they could no longer remember who was cousin, who was sibling, or who was child. Yet what made this story so disturbing wasn't just their condition, it was the silence around it. The nearby communities knew, the state knew, the church knew, but no one wanted to claim responsibility. It was easier to pretend that such a thing couldn't exist in modern America, that something this raw, this tragic, could only belong to old folklore and Gothic novels. But this wasn't fiction. It was a slow decay, one that unfolded over lifetimes. And as the truth came to light, those who studied the family realized the horror wasn't only in what they looked like, but in what had been done to them. Because this wasn't a story about monsters. It was a story about what happens when a family is forgotten, left to wither in the dark until even humanity starts to fade. The deeper investigators dug, the more impossible the story became to ignore. Birth records, or what few existed, revealed a chain of marriages that read like echoes of the same mistake, repeated over and over. A father marrying his niece, a mother giving birth to her own half-brother. Children listed with no father at all, only a first name. Sometimes even that was crossed out, as if whoever wrote it couldn't bring themselves to finish. But it wasn't just the documents that told the story, it was the land itself. The family's property, once hundreds of acres of farmland, had collapsed into a maze of rusted cars, rotted sheds, and unmarked graves. Locals said that if you stood in the woods long enough, you could still hear faint laughter or crying carried by the wind from the hollow. They didn't call it a home. They called it the pocket of time, a place where the past had refused to die. Those who finally visited the site described it like stepping into another world. The air was still, heavy with a smell of rot and iron. Old toys lay half buried in the dirt, their faces melted by rain and sun. On the porch, a rocking chair creaked by itself, as though the ghost of the matriarch still waited there, watching for her children to return from a walk they took decades ago and never came back from. Inside the house, they found relics of lives lived in silence, mason jars filled with old nails and animal bones, a Bible missing half its pages, and in one room, family portraits drawn in pencil on the wall, each figure connected by faint, overlapping lines. It was a family tree, but drawn like a prison map. The saddest part was how they lived not out of evil, but out of ignorance. Cut off from the world by geography and shame, they survived on what they had, each other. Over time, the boundaries between family, survival, and sin blurred until they no longer meant anything. To them, this was normal, and when the outsiders finally came, journalists, doctors, historians, they didn't find villains. They found people trapped in a legacy they didn't choose. Bodies twisted by generations of the same blood, yes, but souls that still laughed, still tried to live, still looked up at visitors with curiosity, not fear. The horror wasn't in their faces. The horror was in how the world had left them there, for so long, to become something unrecognizable. When word of the discovery spread beyond the mountains, the story twisted like a broken mirror. Newspapers turned them into freaks. Photographers came to capture what they called the most inbred family in America, turning private suffering into a public spectacle. They didn't write about the years of isolation or the poverty or the quiet desperation that had built this tragedy. They wrote about the faces, the deformities, the shock value. The world wanted horror, and horror was what it saw. But those who spent more time there, who looked past the surface, saw something far more devastating. A pattern of inherited pain that reached far beyond biology. Generations of rejection had taught them to fear outsiders. When someone from the town tried to help, the family would hide in the woods, watching silently from the trees. They didn't understand why people stared, why they laughed. All they knew was that every time someone came close, it ended in humiliation. And so, the silence grew heavier, thicker, until words became almost useless. Some of them stopped speaking entirely, communicating only with grunts, gestures, and the language of survival. Doctors later described it as a cultural collapse, a slow unraveling of social and emotional understanding. But to those who saw them in person, it felt like looking at the echo of humanity itself, something once pure, reduced to its most primitive form, not by nature, but by neglect. One researcher called it a mirror we refuse to look into, because deep down, this wasn't about one family. It was about what happens when an entire society decides certain people are beneath saving, when the poor are left to rot in forgotten valleys, when help never comes, and generations grow up without education, guidance, or even the knowledge that life could be different. That's when the curse begins, not with blood, but with abandonment. By the time the final generation was documented, there was no going back. The genetic damage was irreversible, and the emotional scars, far worse. They had lived their whole lives in a world that didn't want to see them, and when it finally did, it looked away again. And yet, there was one last secret the family had kept, something no one had noticed until a historian stumbled on a single, handwritten letter found inside that old house. A letter that would change everything people thought they knew about them. The letter was found tucked inside the cracked spine of a family Bible, its paper yellowed, edges burnt as though someone had once tried to destroy it. The handwriting was fragile, uneven, the kind that comes from trembling hands and a heart too full of regret. It was written by a woman named Eliza, the family matriarch from nearly a century ago. Her words were short, almost childlike, but what they revealed was nothing short of haunting. If anyone finds this, please know we didn't mean for it to happen this way. We were alone. No one came. The roads were gone. The preacher stopped coming, the doctor too. We did what we could to live. We only had each other. There was no bitterness in her writing, only a quiet sorrow that soaked through every line. She wrote about how the snow would bury the valley every winter, how food would run out, how the children would grow sick and pale. She begged for help that never came. And then, near the end, her tone changed. I see what's happening to the little ones. I know now what we've done. But how can we stop it, when there's no one left but us? It was the confession of a woman trapped by the very bloodline she tried to protect. She knew what they were becoming, but she had no way out. And as her family's world shrank, her guilt grew, until it became another part of the inheritance. Passed down through generations of silence and deformity, that letter, historians believe, was her final attempt to reach beyond the valley, to tell the world that they were not monsters, but victims of distance, ignorance, and time. It never reached anyone. It stayed hidden, pressed between the pages of a Bible no one opened for nearly 100 years. When the letter was finally made public, it changed how people spoke about the family. The grotesque fascination turned into something quieter, sadder. People began to see them not as the most inbred, but as the most abandoned. And maybe that's why this story still lingers, because it forces us to look at the edge of our humanity and ask what happens when compassion runs out. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed, or would you have run? After the letter's discovery, researchers began piecing together the final years of the family's existence. The photographs from the 1990s showed only a handful of survivors, 3 brothers and a sister, living in a decaying house that seemed to sag beneath the weight of generations. They didn't understand the cameras. They didn't understand the attention. They only knew that people had come again, and that meant danger. One of the brothers was known for communicating through sounds, barks, grunts, and wheezes that echoed through the woods. At first, outsiders mocked it. They called it animalistic. But experts later discovered that it was a form of adapted communication, built out of necessity, passed down through the years. It was their language, their way of connecting when words had long since failed them. It's unsettling to think about, but imagine this: a family whose ancestors once read books, wrote letters, sang hymns, and now, generations later, they spoke in echoes of animals. Not because they wanted to, because time, isolation, and shame had stripped away everything else. And yet, even in that state, they weren't violent. They weren't cruel. The social worker who met them said something few ever heard. She said, "They smiled at me." She described them as gentle, even joyful in fleeting moments, like children who never grew up. They loved to play with stray dogs, to run barefoot in the mud, to laugh in strange, guttural bursts that sounded more like cries than joy. It was heartbreaking, yes, but also profoundly human. The family had been reduced to something raw, something the rest of the world couldn't understand. But beneath the deformities, beneath the sounds, there was still a spark of life trying to survive. When the last surviving member died in the early 2000s, the authorities sealed off the property. The house was condemned, the records locked away. The state didn't want tourists. They didn't want attention. They wanted to bury it again, to erase the evidence that such a story could happen in modern America. But legends don't stay buried, and sometimes silence only feeds the ghost of what was lost. To this day, hikers who stray too deep into that valley claim to hear something strange, a faint cry or laughter carried on the wind. Some say it's just the wind moving through the trees. Others say it's what's left of a family that never learned how to stop calling out for help. Today, the valley where that family once lived is almost gone, swallowed by vines, mud, and memory. The old house has collapsed in on itself, leaving only a skeleton of wood and rust. But the story, it still breathes. It exists in the archives of universities, in the whispered recollections of locals, and in the uneasy silence of anyone who's ever seen those photographs and realized this isn't ancient history. It's modern America. Historians still argue over how to define it. Was it a case study in genetic decay, a failure of social care, a living metaphor for generational trauma? Maybe it's all of that. But beneath the science, beneath the sociology, lies something simpler and far more uncomfortable. This family was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when compassion fails and shame replaces understanding. Because this wasn't just a story of inbreeding. It was a story of inheritance, not of property or pride, but of pain, passed down, multiplied, embedded into the body until it became impossible to separate what was family and what was curse. Every child born into that house carried not only the DNA of their ancestors, but the silence, the hunger, and the loneliness of every generation before them. And that's what makes this story so haunting. It forces us to look at how easily people can vanish inside their own bloodlines when the world stops looking. We like to think tragedies like this belong to another time, another place. But even now, in forgotten corners of the country, families lie cut off by poverty, by addiction, by fear, turning inward, just like this one did, until the outside world is no longer real. So maybe the lesson isn't about horror at all. Maybe it's about the danger of forgetting, about what happens when empathy fades and generations are left to rot in silence. The photographs remain, the letter remains, the whispers in the valley remain, and maybe that's enough to remind us that some ghosts don't need to be seen to exist. They just need to be remembered, because every secret, no matter how buried, waits to be unearthed, and every family tree, no matter how twisted, still reaches toward the light.